food allergy is typically a response to a food through an antibody that's called IgE. Those kind of real allergy tests can be done in different ways. Sometimes they're skin prick tests, sometimes they're blood tests. Food sensitivity means that the food is not the right food for us at this moment. Hello and welcome back to the Good Gut Feeling podcast, where we digest modern medicine with old world wisdom. Today we're going to talk about something that so many people are confused about, and we are going to clarify what is a true allergy to food, what is a true food allergy, what is a food sensitivity, and what are foods that we just should not eat. Because these have been used in many ways interchangeably, and they are really not. They're really not interchangeable. And we're gonna get to the bottom of it. Before we start, a couple of words. This episode is for educational purposes only and doesn't take the place of medical advice from your doctor. What is a true food allergy? A food allergy is typically a response to a food through an antibody that's called IgE. And the true food allergies usually have a response like a rash, hives, itchiness, sneezing perhaps. Some of the very severe allergies, like we have been seeing, like peanut allergies, is like the throat closing up. Those are usually very severe allergies, or swelling of the tongue or swelling of the mouth. Those are true allergies. Those allergies can be from medications, and they can be from some foods, nuts in particular. Some people have really true allergies to nuts. Those allergies can be anywhere from mild and uncomfortable, like itchiness and hives, to life-threatening, where people's throat closes up and they can't breathe. True food allergies, and these are typically mediated by an antibody called IgE. Those kind of real allergy tests can be done in different ways. Sometimes they're skin prick tests, sometimes they're blood tests. Typically, the blood tests are IgE. Those are standard allergy tests that also need to be evaluated with a grain of salt. Meaning, if the number is not 0, but it's low, and there's really no response that you may know of from that specific food. For example, someone may have a slightly elevated IgE to bananas. It is likely that that slightly elevated IgE is not an allergy. So usually those kind of tests need to be evaluated with a clinical picture and the value. So if the value is low, no real correlation, many times not a real allergy. But if there is a real response, could be a real allergy. And we're talking about allergic reactions. These are similar type of process, whether it could be to a medication, or it could be to seasons, or it could be to animals. Those are mediated by antibodies that really produce true allergies. Now, something we've been seeing thrown around, and I've seen it quite a bit in patients who come to me as second opinions, who may have seen other functional medicine doctors. They get food sensitivity testing. That is very common. Food sensitivity testing. And many people call our office asking for that. And I'm gonna tell you, I wish there was a good test for it. There are tests. There are particularly an antibody called IgG. And these are very often in the tests that are marketed as food sensitivity tests. Remember, for a test has to be reliable. It has to be accurate. Just because a test says it tests for food sensitivity and someone has a positive value, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person has a food sensitivity. Because every test has to be standardized, meaning I'm testing for X, and if most of the time when that X is positive on the test, it's equivalent to that condition, that is usually a good test. but there is no test that's 100%. Every test has a positive predictive value, a negative predictive value, sensitivity and specificity, meaning some tests are very sensitive to pick things up. So every single true allergy sensitivity or whatever it is that comes up on the test is really true. However, it picks up a whole other bunch of other stuff that may not be. So that could be a very sensitive test. A very specific test is every one that's picked up is really a real food sensitivity. However, not all of them are picked up. So we want something balanced that has a pretty good specificity, a pretty good sensitivity, and that's usually how tests become standardized after testing. So just because something is marketed as a test for X does not mean that it really is the right test. And I'm going to tell you there really are no good tests for food sensitivities. So people want that test and I wish it existed. It does not. And the tests that are marketed as IgG food testing are generally not reliable. Sometimes there is a correlation and sometimes there isn't, but you can't go by a test that doesn't have great standardization. An IgG is an antibody that's not necessarily designed to pick up sensitivities. So if you have a test that you've had an IgG food sensitivity test, which is pretty much most of the food sensitivity tests are IgG based. They're usually only available in functional medicine practices. They are not a standardized test. So if you have that, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't eat those foods. And just because the foods didn't actually have a high IgG doesn't mean you should be eating them, because those tests are not reliable. So I've had patients who come to me with those tests as second opinions. Oh, I went to this and I started eating like this, but it didn't help. And I ask them, well, what happens if you don't eat it or you do eat? Well, I don't notice a difference. I hear that way too much. And even though sometimes we don't feel a difference when we eat the wrong foods for us right away, sometimes we feel it later on, but still those tests are not reliable. So how do we know what to eat? So food sensitivity means that the food is not the right food for us at this moment. It doesn't necessarily mean that the food is bad for everyone. It doesn't necessarily mean that this food is not going to be good for us later. So maybe when we're feeling great, this food can be a good option even for us who are sensitive at this moment. But it's not necessarily a bad food because maybe other people just do great with it. And that's a food sensitivity. So a food sensitivity may be specific for us, or it may be even specific for us at this time. But it may not be a bad food and it may not be a bad food for us. Now, just plain bad food. That food may not be good for anyone. That food may be bad for everyone. And that's really the ultra processed foods, the high sugar foods, the foods that are inflammatory. And not everything's inflammatory for the same person. But if we start looking at foods that have been modified by man in some way, then we're heading towards a place where foods should not be eaten. For example, if you take a healthy chicken, some people may just not do well with chicken, but if the chicken's healthy and it was pasture raised and it walked around and it ate worms and it got exercise and it wasn't stressed out in horrible conditions, that's not a toxic food. There are still some people that may not do well with it. Some people may have a full-blown allergy to it. Some people may be sensitive to it at that moment, but they could potentially eat it later. And some people, maybe it's not the food for them ever. But for some people, that food is okay. Now, if we start going into the fast food industry, the ultra-processed food, even the people that can eat the chicken, the healthy chicken with no problem, that's not a good food. So that's the third category. The third category is the foods that are just not good for people in general. And the truth is, the foods that fall into that category are typically not the foods that have been made as nature intended, that have not been tampered with, that have not been processed. Those foods don't belong in that category. Those foods may still belong in the first two categories, but not in that one. So now we come back to the same question. Okay, so let's say you don't have a full-blown allergy. You don't have a full-blown allergy. You just don't know what to eat because there's no good test for the sensitivities. What do I eat? Now there is a lot of this is understanding what a person needs based on their health condition, based on their health state. There's different ways to assess what a person needs to be eating, but there are some basic guidelines. If you are feeling good, if you're in a good state of health, if you're getting enough sleep and you're not totally stressed and you're generally at a good baseline, the kinds of food you can eat are likely broad, as long as they are not in the third category of foods that no one should be eating. Those, you can probably eat most foods that are healthy, that are non-tampered with and are not processed, that most of those foods are probably okay for that person. Now, when someone starts going into inflammation, and let's say they're extremely inflamed, like some of the Crohn's colitis patients we see that are very inflamed, maybe bleeding, in a lot of pain, maybe can't gain weight. For them, they are so sensitized that it takes so little to put them over that their nutrition has to be much more restricted. So there's a whole bunch of good foods. There's a whole bunch of good foods that maybe other people can be eating, or maybe even they can be eating when they are in a good place. However, at this current time, it needs to be restricted. That's usually restricted to foods that are cooked. So raw foods are great in terms of nutritional value. However, they are often more difficult to digest. So if someone's inflamed, raw foods may not be the best foods for them. Cooked foods, cooked neutral foods that are easy to digest, such as cooked vegetables, such as soups. Soups are the most easily digested food for many people because one, it's liquidy, and two, it's well cooked. And so if you are going to eat animal protein, for example, when you are highly inflamed, the soup is the best bet. Bone broth. Bone broth has great healing properties for the gut, has collagen, has amino acids, has many healing properties, and has great nutritional value while being easy to digest. Whereas, let's say you just to take a piece of steak from a cow may be much more difficult to digest. The same thing even with chicken. So you take a piece of chicken, someone who's very inflamed may have a hard time with that if they're very inflamed. But you put some chicken in chicken soup, and even if they have the pieces of chicken that are well cooked in a liquidy environment, easier to digest. So the highly inflamed people stick to highly cooked foods. Stay away from raw foods. Definitely keep it clean. This is not the time to really get expansive with spices, with dairy, with gluten products. It's really a better time to really restrict and keep it well cooked. If you are doing amazing and you are at your peak baseline, this is when really all good foods may be good possibilities for you. Because you can eat raw and you can eat cooked and you can eat healthy animal protein, you can eat great veggies and fruits. And if you're somewhere in the middle, it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum. And as you get better, you move towards the more broad category and you can open up your diet. So remember, food allergies are real allergies. Food sensitivities are real sensitivities with no great test. And junky foods, no one should be eating. I hope this helps clarify your food choices. We're going to be talking about so many things food related, and I am so excited. So stay healthy, stay gutsy, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.